The election of 1860 and the secession crisis. Let's just say at the outset, let's hope, pray if you pray, that the 2024 election is not in the future repeatedly compared to the 1860 election. If we're lucky, it won't be. If we're unlucky, it will be. The election of 1860 is the only election in our history. Well, now with one unsettled exception, it is the only election in our history where the side that lost refused to accept the result. In Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, which I now just learned this morning is among a number of documents and readings on the canvas for the students, which our good friend Michael Hepp in the President's office has not sent out to all the rest of you. I will be getting on Michael as soon as... Michael, are you here? I hope not. I'm embarrassing you. He has not been sending out to all of our beloved community people. I'm working on that as we speak. But in his 4th of July speech, among many other things, that great work of irony, that great work of a criticism of American political and moral hypocrisy like few others, he said, the 4th of July is yours. Speaking, of course, to his white American audience, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn, to drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems or inhuman mockery. It's sacrilegious irony. That's so Douglas. He didn't just say it's irony, it's sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a peril to your conduct. And let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, towering up to heaven, were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty. This is very Old Testament here, folks. Burying that nation in irrevocable ruin. I can today take up the plaintive lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people. And there, without announcing his text, he just floats into the 137th Psalm because he knew his audience knew it. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there, they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. That comes from a deep source in the history of Christian cosmology and Christian millennialism at its depth, which believed that somehow there are peoples, you don't have to believe it, but believe that somehow there are peoples, maybe nations, chosen to be the vessel of some kind of profound possibility in the world, but they will probably be destroyed first. Probably facing a reckoning they can't handle. They might even get obliterated and a few of them pass on to make it again, to revive it again, to prepare again the coming of the Lord. Psalm 137 is a powerful, terrifying. What has Douglas just said? You invited me here to sing for you, and I ain't going to sing. I'm going to make you hurt. I'm going to go for the jugular of your conscience. And he did. W.B. Du Bois went to Harper's Ferry in 1932. Du Bois, who could write in sometimes the most biblical of prose, though he was himself probably pretty secular. He gave a speech in 1932 at Harper's Ferry, remembering John Brown. And he concluded the speech with this. Some people, said Du Bois, have the idea that crucifixion, is a more powerful image in Christianity than the cross. There is no Christianity without the cross. Some people have the idea that the crucifixion consists in punishment of an innocent man. But the essence of crucifixion is that men are killing a criminal. Jesus was a criminal in the Roman Empire. That men have got to kill him. And yet, that the act of crucifying him is the salvation of the world. Can you imagine a phone ringing while John Brown is on the gallows? Hold up. Okay, hit the rope. To conclude Du Bois, John Brown broke the law. He killed human beings. Those people who defended slavery had to execute John Brown, although they knew. Did they? In killing him, they were committing the greater crime. It is out of that human paradox that comes crucifixion. Okay. Now, it says up here, providential history breaks apart. Did it ever? America's religious sexual immission slips the bonds of law. Those are nice phrases. That's a good academic line, isn't it? Whoa, slips the bonds of law. A good Yalie, a great Yalie, Lyman Beecher, was born here in New Haven in 1775. He'll go on to be the great patriarch of the huge Beecher family. He was a student at Yale and studied with Timothy Dwight. Staunch, kind of counter-revolutionary Calvinist. He won't come out exactly like Timothy Dwight. For the next 3 decades, Lyman Beecher pastored churches in Connecticut and out on Long Island. In 1832, he went west, like so many other Americans by the 1830s, and he became the head of the Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, which became quite an anti-slavery seminary and will have a rebellion and help found a whole new kind of Midwestern abolitionism. He had no less than 13 children. 7 sons went into the ministry, including the great Henry Ward Beecher, known as the abolitionist preacher, pastored the great famous Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. The only person remembered with a statue on the campus of Amherst College where he went. There's a huge statue, Henry Ward Beecher there. Nobody knows who he is. He had a lot of daughters too, 6 of them. The reformer Catherine Beecher, the suffragist Isabel Beecher Hooker, and that little woman who wrote the novel, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Amazing family. Beecher, though, he was hardly alone in this. In fact, he represented thousands of other ministers, so many of whom trained right here, who came to envision America through what James Davison Hunter calls a kind of hybrid enlightenment, a mixture of secular and deeply religious visions that said this America, this republic, and remember, Beecher grew up with the Revolution. He's born the year before, 1775. He grows up with the revolution. He inherits the revolution. He inherits its ideologies. And he very much learns his Puritan theology. Beecher came to represent, again, with many, many others, this idea of America having a moral Christian mission. Chosen to be a model, chosen nation. Its purpose of which was, we don't have to like it. We know it caused a lot of trouble, but its mission was, according to Beecher, the, quote, moral renovation of humankind. Mankind, he said. Democracy and religion, in this case Protestant religion, would march together. They didn't necessarily advocate a theocracy per se. They really did believe in Republican principles, in expanding the right to vote eventually, in, some faith and reason. And Yale helped some of them know that because Yale had the sciences under Silliman and many, many others. But what came from this was what we tend to call a providential sense of history. We don't use that term much anymore. It's been soiled by the past in some ways. But in the 19th century, almost everybody used the term providence, the doctrine of providence, the idea of providence. Providence was, of course, God in some way. But it was always converted into this idea that God had a design. God had plans. We can't always know them, but that's why we have really well-trained preachers. They're supposed to explain it to us, lay it out to us. There was a providential grand design. Beecher's words, grand design. And there was great peril in this. If you take on this mission, you're going to have trouble. Anybody with a creed and a passionate mission is going to rub people, right? Probably wrong way at times. You're going to have deep peril. You're going to get beaten at times. But there's going to be deliverance if you believe in this Christian vision of history. And nation building, which is what the American Republic was supposed to be about, it was special, it was unusual, there are hardly any republics on planet Earth. Nation building was to be a moral Christian creation. And the Second Great Awakening only fueled that, the tremendous revivals of the 1820s and into the 1830s, which in part, not solely, gave birth to American abolitionism. It gave birth then, too, to a millennial understanding of history. And by that, it's not that complicated a word. We make it that way sometimes. And today, someone's a millennialist. We want to run, some of us want to run from them. They're probably Christian nationalists, and we don't want to know how they vote. But millennialism is a deep, old, abiding conception of the connection between religion and history. And in the Christians, lots of religions have a form of millennialism, but in this vision, in this Protestant America, it meant there would be a second coming. Fundamental to Christian doctrine, there would be a second coming someday. The job of people was to prepare for it. Prepare the land, prepare the law, prepare people, prepare themselves. Now, the unusually and strangely sometimes American version of this was a version, there were different versions of this, but most millennialists actually did believe in some version of separation of church and state. That fundamental principle in the Bill of Rights. They just believed everybody had the free will to be Protestant. And they needed help along the way. It's what James Davison Hunter has called an American hybrid enlightenment. Partly secular, partly religious, deeply historical, believing in a version of history. I once had a professor in graduate school who said, all right, we can read all this theory about history and how history occurs and how it's shaped. Is it bottom up or top down? He said, look, there are only two really ideological versions of history. One is Marxist and one is Christian. If you choose to really believe in either one of them, he basically told us, you are messed up. But that was his view. All right. Why am I doing this? Because that American republic that tore itself apart, slipped the bonds of law, broke in 1860-61, both sides believed this. Both sides were millennialists. Both sides believed in American mission. Both sides used the same Bible. They found different versions. They found different passages. There's no question, though. Both sides believe this. Let me give you an example or two. There's so many examples of this. It's, here we are. You can find all over the rhetoric of the late 1850s. I mentioned the other day the incredible quotation from Wendell Phillips, who said, what we have is a resurrection, we have an insurrection of thought, we may soon have an insurrection of arms. Well, that's fine. But in religious circles, which are becoming as much secular circles, there's Daniel Alexander Payne, the presiding bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a black bishop, that first great organized national black church, the AME. He declared in the secession winter 1861, quote, "The great deliverance of abolition may be upon us." Quote, the Lord God Almighty, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Isaac and Jacob couldst have moved the heart, only they couldst have moved the heart of this nation to have done so great a deed for this weak, despised people. He sees abolition now coming in the very secession of these southern states. He is not going to be alone. But then on the other side, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these, there was whole books written on the sermons of Southern preachers and Confederate ministers and so on. There was the Southern Methodist minister, J.W. Tucker, who boldly pronounced in the secession winter to a Confederate audience, quote, "Your cause is the cause of God, the cause of Christ, the cause of humanity." We go on. Both sides pointed to Scripture very specifically. There is not a word in the New Testament, declared an abolitionist theologian, Tyler Lewis, about buying and selling slaves. You got to be pretty selective in reading your Bible to say that, but that's what we do, don't we, with sacred texts. And then there's Reverend Henry Van Dyke, Southerner, Confederate, who said, "When the abolitionist tells me that slaveholding is a sin, in the simplicity of my faith in the Holy Scriptures, I point to this sacred record and tell him in all candor, as my text does, my text, that his teaching blasphemes the name of God and all of his doctrines." There are 1,000 more quotes where those come from. And then there are the sort of secular voices, we could say, of this hybrid enlightenment. Yeah, I'm going to use a Lincoln quote in a minute, so I'll get him up here. Lincoln became very good friends. That's not, I should have, mistake. This is Jefferson Davis, of course. He comes into the picture today very much on behalf of those Southern Democrats in 1860. But Lincoln became very close friends in the House of Representatives when he served there with one Alexander H. Stephens, a congressman. He called him Alex, wrote him letters. Alex, what's up? Well, not quite that. But Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia. Stephens, who will soon become vice president of the Confederacy, gave what in retrospect has become an exceedingly famous speech called the Cornerstone Speech. This is not by Jefferson Davis, it's by his vice president. The Cornerstone Speech had this passage in it. The enslavement and by the way, he gave it in spring 1860. The eve of that 1860 election. The campaigns are beginning, candidates are being chosen. Alexander H. Stephens announces. He said, the enslavement of the African was, he said, some claim the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature. Stephens says, no. All who say that are, quote, fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This is continuing with Alexander Stephens. This was an error. Beware when politicians and clergymen start talking about error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth, echoing Justice Taney and Dred Scott, the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. The Cornerstone Speech got reprinted, republished, reprinted, and disseminated. What's the cornerstone of the Confederation? Students, you've all read the Charles Dew book, and everyone else, you're more than welcome to, which is about those, secession commissioners sent from the Deep South to the Upper South to try to convince other slave states to join in the crusade known as the Confederacy. What do they argue? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. All right. Now, that election. As I said, may we never, hopefully, call our impending, that's the last thing I'll say. Last thing I'll say in the course about 2024. Oh. Well, this election is extraordinary. It was, first of all, a four-way election. What happens when we have four-way elections? Nobody gets a majority. You can count on that. Why was it four-way? Because the Union was so divided. There are going to be four candidates, of course. Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party, John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky of the Democrats, or one part of the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, Stephen Douglas, same Stephen Douglas, who's been around for a decade now trying to, save the Union. And finally, John Bell of a party called the Constitutional Union Party. Now, how does this come about? Well, first of all, this new Republican Party, as we've said before, is going to hold its national convention in Chicago. Its leading candidate for quite some time was William H. Seward, front runner, if you want, from New York, a pretty staunchly anti-slavery U.S. senator, widely known across the landscape. But there's this guy in Illinois now, this guy named Lincoln, who gave that amazing speech at Cooper Union in the spring of 1860, in effect announcing his candidacy if anybody cared. And that extraordinary speech, which is one part carefully researched history, about the nature of the American Republic and other republics. And then he has a whole section where he personally addresses Southerners. He knows this is going to be read. And then a final section where he personally addresses Northerners. While addressing the Southerners in the famous Cooper Union speech, Lincoln said, "Your purpose then." And again, when you read Abraham Lincoln, always read for the logic. And sometimes the politics behind that logic. "Your purpose then, plainly stated, is that you will destroy the government unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please on all points in dispute between you and us. You will rule or ruin in all events." He's setting the stage here for where the blame ought to go. Next page of the speech, he says, "But you will not abide the election of a Republican president, you say. In that supposed event," this is still spring '60, election hasn't happened. "In that event, you say, you will destroy the Union. And then you say, the great crime of having destroyed it will be upon us." Where are we hearing that now? Who's destroying our democracy? And then Lincoln says, "That is cool." Cool? "A highwayman holds the pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, 'Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be the murderer.'" Yeah? And then he has that section where he says, "And now a few words to my fellow Republicans." And he tries to get them to think harmony, keep thinking unity, keep thinking how to save this experiment, this republic, and try, if they can, to not always think in what's right and wrong. And yet, how does he end the speech? "Wrong as we think slavery is, we can yet afford to let it alone where it is, because that much is due to the necessity arising from its actual presence in the nation. Under law," Lincoln is saying, we can't end slavery in the existing slave states because slaves there are property under law. He's trying to get his fellow Republicans to respect law now. But then he ends the speech, "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor the dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." There's a real paradox there, isn't there? Oh, Lord. Lincoln's going to get the nomination of that Republican Party partly because he was considered more moderate than William H. Seward, which was sort of true. The Democratic Party chose to have its convention, they choose these things a year or more in advance, just like they do today. They had chose to have it in Charleston, South Carolina. A terrible mistake. If there was a hotbed of secessionist thinking and prediction before this election, it was Charleston. A few other places too. But at that convention, the Democratic Party met, but they had a 2/3 rule. You had to have 2/3 of the vote of the delegates to get the nomination. And they're very divided. They met in June in Charleston, and the deepest pro-slavery element of the Democratic Party, led by Jefferson Davis, there's Jeff Davis on your right, more about him as the days go by. Davis led a group of deeply pro-slavery Democrats who wanted to have federal protection, is what they called it, for slave ownership anywhere in the West. Now, they'd already had the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision had wiped out the Missouri Compromise line at 3630 parallel. What more do you want? A lot of Republicans are going to say to them. And these Democrats said, we don't trust you. We need this against, quote, unfriendly legislation that could come in the future. Yeah. They feared that too many Northerners, those damned Republicans, would ignore and fight the Dred Scott case, which they were. And what did the Republicans in the North fear? A second Dred Scott decision. That's what solidifies slavery in the West forever. They want what they called a slave code for the territories in federal law, guaranteeing the eternal existence of slavery in any jurisdiction of the United States. At the convention, they tore themselves apart. A huge segment of the Democratic Party, struggling desperately to remain a national party and failing, wanted to run Stephen Douglas for president, the Illinoisan, author of Kansas, Nebraska, a very pro-Southern enactment, of course. Stephen Douglas, in his own way, pro-slavery, but not like those from the Deep South. Douglas supporters managed to pass a platform without this formal declaration of a slave code for the territories. Southern delegates from 8 states stalked out of the convention, just walked out. The convention was over. No one was going to get a 2/3. What did they do? They held 2 conventions. The Southerners met about 3 weeks later in Baltimore and nominated John C. Breckinridge, a good pro-slavery Democrat, although from an upper South state, note that, not from Mississippi. They don't nominate Jefferson Davis, not yet. They try to think of somebody a little more moderate, but not much. And Stephen Douglas they abandoned their 2/3 rule. Democrats met again, said they were the real Democratic Party, nominated Stephen Douglas. The Democrats now have 2 candidates for president. What happens to any party that does that? They're going to lose. They've cut themselves in half. It's not just a third party movement. It's splitting your own party. I've studied this stuff too long, and when I hear people start mouthing how they want a third party and they're not sure they want to vote for either candidate, I get belligerent and nasty. This happened Friday night with a working group we had in town, and I think they all but threw me out. So you had the National Democrats and the Southern Democrats, and a Republican candidate now, and that Republican Party had a platform that was damn clear. They stood, they said, for the resistance, eternal resistance to any expansion of slavery into a Western territory. So many people were scared of what this election could bring now. You think we're scared? People were scared. Oh, God, what's going to happen here? All these threats of secession and disunion coming from the Deep South. What will the Upper South do? Oh, Lord. What if a Republican wins and doesn't even get near a majority, which is exactly what happens? So some people got together. They called themselves the Constitutional Union Party. They gathered... I believe they gathered in, I forget the city now. Sorry about that. Probably Philadelphia. They called popular sovereignty, Stephen Douglas's old idea, deception and fraud. They didn't like that. They said the Southern Democrats were wild-eyed and crazy. Can't trust them either. And the Republicans, this Lincoln may seem more moderate, but they're really nothing but radical abolitionists. So what the country needed in this election, they argued, was a moderate middle. What did they stand for? They said the Constitution. All right. What version? What interpretation? Well, they said they were for high tariffs, free homesteads, and the rights of immigrants. The Republican Party was for all of those things. But they threw together a coalition of frightened border state people. They explicitly denied the power of any legislation to legalize slavery in the territories. They kind of sided with the Republicans on several things, but they feared the Republicans and they feared all of the Democrats. At any rate, the Constitutional Union Party was just vague enough that they're going to get a lot of votes. Almost 600,000 votes. 12.6% of the... This party didn't even exist. Suddenly it existed overnight. It got 12% of the vote, almost 13. Can you imagine that right now? Some party is so scared and frightened of what's going to happen in this election, they just invented... Well, there is that group called... Well, there's some group called Middle This or Middle That, I don't know. They have their own podcast. And they're going to run John Bell from Kentucky. When in doubt, go to Kentucky in these years, because it's in the middle there. It's a slave state, but it's a border state. Hell, Abraham Lincoln was even born there. And Jefferson Davis was born there, although he's not on the ticket yet. It's like everybody running here had a Kentucky link. All right, what happens in the election? It's what too many people predicted. Look at the numbers. Lincoln gets 1.8 something million votes, not even 40%. Breckinridge gets 848,000 votes, about 18%. Stephen Douglas, almost 30% of the vote, 1.382 million. And Constitutional Union candidate John Bell gets what he gets. Now, Lincoln got barely 40% of the vote, but he will become president because he won the Electoral College. He won the Electoral College because he won most of the northern states. He carried all of the northern states and all of their electoral votes except 3 in New Jersey. New Jersey found a way to split its vote between Stephen Douglas and Abe Lincoln. Breckinridge carried all of the slave states except, note where they are, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. Boom. Whoops. Sorry about that. Whoops. What did I do? Oh, you can see it. Okay. Anyway, it's up here. Bell wins Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. That Constitutional Union Party won 3 border states. The only state that Stephen Douglas actually won with his 1.382 million votes was Missouri. Electoral College is a weird animal, folks. A really weird animal. Lincoln won by a landslide in the Electoral College, and he got 39.8% of the vote. Democracy. Lincoln received only 26,000 votes all across the South. He was not even on the ballot in 10 slave states. Breckinridge was not on the ballot in 3 northern states. This is a breakdown of democracy when one side is not even on the ballot. Okay. What happens next, of course, is the secession of the Deep South, and at least the Deep South first, 7 states. Now, it's worth noting, This map shows you by the dates, and I don't know, you can't read all that there, I'm sure. The greenish part are free states and the territories, the yellowish part are the border states, and states staying in the Union, at least at first. The pinkish part, I guess that's pink, or beige, I don't know, are the slave states that do secede between December 20 and the end of January 1861. There's a gray portion here, which are slave states seceding after the attack on Fort Sumter, which is, of course, the Upper South. Now, obviously unprecedented. Obviously, people have to look to different parts of the Constitution to understand just what secession means. There will be a roiling overnight debate, of course, about whether secession is legal or justified. Lincoln and most Republicans will argue, no, it is not. There is no right in the Constitution to secede, Lincoln will argue vehemently, and he will all but order his fellow Republicans privately in the secession winter to hold the line, hold the line. Even some Republicans will admit there's no right of secession, but there surely is a right of revolution. That's in the Declaration of Independence. You want to secede from the Union? It's an act of revolution. Okay? Well, what does it say in the Constitution? The president shall have the power to put down domestic insurrection. Lincoln immediately will interpret these acts as domestic insurrection. Well, the Upper South is crucial here, though. Think of it this way. I think I have another, I do. Here you go. What were the territories or areas of the South most against secession? Look at the blue. The regions which were for secession, look at the yellow. Here and there in some counties, they held local elections where they were bitterly divided, and that's the gray sections. A lot of the Upper South was against secession. And Southerners are going to have to make choices they never wished they had. And here's the key. For most Upper South folk in these blue areas, like the northern half of Alabama, Upper Georgia, even parts of central Georgia, North Carolina and South Carolina is a different matter. All of Western Virginia, West Virginia is still part of Virginia, by the way. It's almost universally against secession. Now, they have a lot of reasons for that. If there's going to be any kind of war, where's it going to be fought? On their land. But the debate they are having, especially in Georgia, which is really a test case, is whether slavery would be safer in the Union if they stayed or out of the Union if they left. And as usual, they don't know the future yet. When you're in the midst of a revolution, you really don't know the future. Woo-wee. Oh, sorry. That's the cartoon from the New Yorker. Let's not mess with that yet. All right. I mentioned Georgia because it's such an interesting case. Most of the states held statewide conventions. South Carolina went out first, December 20, unanimously in convention, seceded from the Union. And yet, there they were, hanging on a tree limb. South Carolina seceded from the Union. Really? And a lot of other southern states said, good luck. Not sure we want to do that yet. In fact, pretty sure we don't, but maybe we will. And they do start holding conventions in other states, namely Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas. But it takes time. Mississippi seceded on January 9th, 1861, 2.5 weeks after South Carolina. Florida did it on January 10th, the next day. Alabama, the next day, January 11th. More than a week later, Georgia. But Georgia did it in convention by a vote, get this, of 166 to 130. Very divided. Upper and parts of middle Georgia delegates said, no, our society, our civilization, slavery itself, our racial system will be safer in the, let's wait till the next election. Hang in there. Wait it out. 166 to 130. Very divided. Bitter debates. But they voted to leave the Union. Louisiana went out on January 26th, and the last of the 7 Deep South, Texas, on February 1st. Texas is big, takes time in Texas. Why did they secede? Many answers, and I'll take you out with this. Oh, Jesus, I got 6-7 minutes. Oh, man. By the way, sometimes you got to smile. I do have a few cartoons. I'll use another one or two next time. I'm not suggesting this represents Yale, but there were some people here who, and the Lord said, they shall gradually, so as not to cause unemployment, beat their swords into plowshares. Gradually. Gradualism had died. Moderation had died. The middle was dying. The Republic itself, the Constitution, slipped the bonds of its law. Soon, that spring, there will be troops marching all over the place. I love this photo. It's downtown Detroit. I think it was first week of June, 1861. It's the 1st Michigan Volunteers Infantry, organized at the state level. Look at the crowds, though. They're on the tops of roofs. They're all over the place. Look at them. You couldn't resist this. Women were making flags and presenting them to the men, making speeches about don't come home unless your body's on your shield and all that nonsense from the Greek wars. But how did it get there? Why secession? Why? First of all, in the outline I put up here, I listed a bunch of reasons. Slavery and the racial order. If you've read Charles Dew's book, you have no question about that. I mean, the old notion, still alive in some circles, even in the circles that Charles Dew grew up in northern Florida, where he was raised. He was raised in the lost cause tradition that said, well, that war wasn't about slavery. It was about tariffs. It was about competing civilizations. It was about economics. Slavery was just an incident. And then he started to read all those secession commissioners, and what did he find? He found them arguing about race control, a social order based on race. He found them arguing for slavery and its future, its eternal future, without which the South cannot exist. A lot of upper South, Southern whites, slaveholders or not, were really convinced by a certain argument that was known as the shrinking South. Look again at the map. Sorry. Map. There we go. Think about it. If over time the Republicans succeed in coordinating, which is exactly what they say they're going to do, they're going to cordon off slavery in the West. There will be no more expansion, westward or southward. And Republicans have stopped no less than 3 efforts already in the 1850s to annex Cuba. Oh my God, had the South ever annexed Cuba? You know how big Cuba is? Southerners began to talk about the theory of the shrinking South. What would happen, they said? Well, the slave population will continue to grow, but it'll have nowhere to go. Slaveholders in the upper South will start selling off their slaves into the deep South and into the Southwest. And what will occur? A powder keg of a slave society that becomes more and more and more dangerous, and the price of slaves will plummet. Now this is, call it what you want. Racial fear, economic fear, fear of loss of civilization and livelihood. Shrinking South was a compelling idea. And a lot of these commissioners used this idea. You better join us, man, or else. And then there's, what many historians over time have called, oops, what am I doing here? I'm sorry. Yeah. Fear, the fear thesis. There, book after book after book started coming out in the 1960s, 70s, and well beyond, that argued that these mutual conspiratorial theories that Northerners and Southerners had of each other created a genuine and powerful politics of fear. If you don't act now, those Republicans who claim they have a moderate running for president, but you scratch an Abe Lincoln and you'll get a John Brown, you can't live in that society anymore. Politics of fear is so powerful throughout our history, and we're living through it right now in a whole new version. Everybody has a fear about this election. What's your fear? Don't answer. What's your fear? Don't answer. With these immediate fears, long-term fears, moral panic, to use a modern term. When Lincoln stood up at the House Divided speech, which, by the way, Southern Democrats started reprinting and sending all over the place, and he talked about putting slavery on a course of ultimate extinction, Southern Democrats said, we should believe what he said. We think he meant it. And guess what? He did. Ultimate extinction. Lincoln wanted it to be gradual. What would be more dangerous became the political question, staying in the Union or leaving. Politics of fear was so potent. And then there's this idea. It used to have a lot of sway in scholarship and historiography that there were just so many Southerners who wanted to create a new nation. Nationalism is a potent set of ideas, isn't it? We keep wishing nations away, and then they just keep growing again and growing again. And whatever ashes and fuel of the last nations. There certainly were Southerners arguing for a Southern nation with a glorious future that would move south, it would move to Mexico, it would create a slave-holding republic and empire. They've been talking about this for years. People like William Lowndes Yancey of Georgia, Robert Redd of South Carolina, Edmund Ruffin of Virginia. They wanted a Southern nation, and they had to begin by separation from the Union. Now, they wanted it to be as big as possible. They wanted all 15 slave states. Confederacy will ultimately only get 11. Anytime you have the fortune or misfortune of observing a Confederate battle flag, notice how many stars there are. I'm just saying. This was a vision of the South having a national independent future. It's a potent force. I'm not sure it's the deepest cause necessarily of Southern secession, but it's certainly one that caught on once they did it. They almost had to. It's a nationalism born in part of resentment, grievance, and defensiveness. Grievance politics, we don't need to be reminded of that either, do we? Is potent. Who doesn't want to have a good grievance? Huh? Did you wake up today with a grievance? Maybe it was just against the damn mirror on the wall. Oh, I don't know. And lastly, scholars spent careers arguing that, this began back in the 1920s and 30s. It was very compelling analysis by scholars like Avery Craven, lots of Southern scholars, but even some Northerners who said, the Confederacy was actually rooted in King Cotton. It was a planter aristocracy. It was rooted in this deep belief in agrarianism. an agrarianism that was based on personal honor. You insult me and I may challenge you to a duel. Yeah, one of us may survive, or not. There's something to this. King Cotton ideology, if you like. This notion of Jefferson's ideal of the Republic of Small Farmers. This was the idea that the real South was not in the master class. It was in that vast, vast majority of yeoman farmers, men of the soil, who will go die for Robert E. Lee by the thousands and thousands. And what were they up against? You need an enemy. They were up against the thieving Yankees. They think they're cool inventors up there, but they're really just bankers after your money. Men of soil against the ignoble, go-getter, money-grubbing Yankee industrialist and individualist. Southern men of the soil understood cooperation with each other. They were keeping capitalism individualistic, they're going to argue. Some of their most brilliant defenders. Non-exploitive, open to all, which was a lie, but lies work. Frank Owsley in the 1930s, a Southern historian who developed this sort of agrarian thesis about secession, and it has died hard, argued that, quote, the fundamental and passionate ideal for which the South stood and fell was the ideal of an agrarian society, people from the farm. And it's in their song. The great anthem of the Confederacy is not Dixie. Well, it was one of them. It's the song called Bonnie Blue Flag, which has a beautiful lie in it. It goes like this. We are a band of brothers, native to the soil. We are a band of brothers, native to the soil, fighting for the property we gain by honest toil. Who doesn't believe in honest toil? A last thought. They hated Southerners, Confederates. They hated what they called the humiliation the North was wreaking upon them, the dishonor, the subordination. Now, do you enact a revolution because you feel humiliated? You might. If you feel disgrace, if you need to develop a kind of a white racial solidarity, you might. As James Jones of South Carolina, a great secessionist who spawned a whole group of Joneses who will become Confederates, said, quote, if we fail, we have saved our honor and lost nothing. Okay, you got your honor. 60% of you are dead, but you got your honor. And they loved their Shakespeare. Who didn't in America? Both sides did. Both sides used the Bible constantly. Both sides used Shakespeare. Southern secessionists were very fond of Henry V, where the victorious Prince Hal on the battlefield addresses Hotspur. Some of you have probably even read it. He's dead and lying on the field, and what does Henry V say to Hotspur? Thy ignominy sleeps with thee in the grave, but not remembered in thy epitaph. If we just write the right epitaph for your death, we'll be fine. It's all about honor. Okay.